We have been hearing about how important stories and storytelling is in business, and yet we don't hear stories.
I mean, you don't have to tell stories. It's okay to waste people's time and bore them.
Great, our listeners are dismissed. You can leave it now.
I have a counterexample to that. Right into the research, no story whatsoever. Everybody was following for 3 hours straight, and everybody left the room like really elated at the end. So what happened there?
There are always exceptions that prove the rule.
Follow up 3 months later, how many of the people in that audience actually changed something as a result? My guess is none. So we have been hearing about how important stories and storytelling is in business for at least the last decade. These days, if you talk to anybody in business, my guess is if you ask, what do you think about storytelling? Is storytelling important? They go, oh yeah, storytelling, very important, got to tell stories. And yet, we don't hear stories in business. We don't see stories in business context, no matter how much people tell you that they believe in them, that they're important, they should be telling them, they just aren't doing it. So Francisco, as our resident story specialist here, one, are stories as important as we've heard? And two, if people are going to tell them, what should they know about it?
I mean, you don't have to tell stories. It's okay to waste people's time and bore them and get nothing done, change no minds, move no one to action. I mean, it's a free country.
Great, our listeners are dismissed. You can leave now.
I guess the problem with that question is that people don't really understand. Well, first they don't understand what a story is, but perhaps more importantly, they don't understand what the alternative is. Because if you're not telling stories, and my definition of story is a real life example that makes a point. If you're not using real life examples to make your point, you are using theory and statements, right? You're saying this is like this. Why? Has it happened before? Have you tried? I'm not going to go there because otherwise I'll be giving you an example. So I'm going to stick to facts. This is this way. Here's the data. And that's fine. But unless people have perfect context, they will struggle to place that in a context that makes sense to them, that connects with the problems they have. So it's just a poor way of communicating. Like, no good communicator is ever going to communicate without using examples, without using analogies, without using metaphors. And the easiest way for most people to do that is to actually find the real example from life that is happening or that has happened and share that. You know, people talk about Steve Jobs all the time, or whatever. Go watch his talks, and they're masterful. It's very difficult to do what he's doing, but there are tons of examples. There's tons of metaphors. If there is not an actual story, there's you can get that he's talking about something that happened in the past, and now he's talking about something that changed, and then so he's still using a lot of story things to talk, and the alternative is just incredibly boring, and is what most people do.
I have a counterexample to that, and I'm really curious what you think, Francisco. So I was at this talk. It was a scientist speaking about how we can live longer, healthier, that sort of thing. And this person came on and said, tonight is not about me. It's all about you and how you can live happier, longer, healthier lives. And then he went right into the research, no story whatsoever. Everybody was following for 3 hours straight, and everybody left the room like really elated at the end. So what happened there?
There are always exceptions that prove the rule, but also So this is what's super important about a story. The most important thing about a story is that, first of all, it gives you something to relate to, because it usually will talk about things happening to real humans. Okay, so this happened to another human. I'm a human. I have similar circumstances in some ways. I feel the same way. Okay, so I can see how this would affect me. So that's the first point. The second thing is that when something happens to another person who feels things, it makes it easier for us to feel things as well. So it can move us emotionally. If you take those things out, if you don't do them explicitly through a story or an example, you are trusting that people are going to be able to do that in their own heads without you helping them along. And when you're talking about health, that is probably easier than most other subjects because, sure, we understand what bad health looks like. We've had experiences. We have people that have suffered through that. But you still have to talk about it in a concrete way. Because if you start
it is already about me because it's about my health. Do you think it was that type of thing?
If it's easy enough for you to put yourself in that position and imagine it happening to you, then maybe you can do away with an example that involves a human being. I would still argue that the example that involves a human being will be easier to understand and more powerful, but you can do away with it in some cases. But I think they're few and far between.
So let me toss something in here. Two things. So my guess is that if it was actually 3 hours long, that while it was probably a barrage of a lot of data and stats, I would be shocked if you went back to a recording of that and did not find stories. First of all, my guess is there were stories in there. They just weren't told the way we typically think of stories. My guess is there were real life examples in there.
What there were was like the story of a study.
So that's still a story.
That type of
that's
story.
Still a that's still a story.
So they did the study in this way. They went and found out they did that
that's
type of thing.
That's real people.
And it was a collage of those.
Right.
So, yeah.
But the second point here is that I would ask, it might have been fascinating. I've been to those kind of lectures. You get just someone who just has data and science, and they just have data and science you've never heard before that's coming from crazy studies that you never, and it's fascinating. What I would ask is, follow up 3 months later, how many of the people in that audience actually changed something as a result? My guess is none. My guess is it's effectively zero. Like a couple of people, maybe people like you who are just like super self-motivated. Whereas if a single really powerful, right, nerds, right, those of us, right? But if a single powerful anchor story, what we call the story hook, had been told that put people in an emotional place to connect something in their own life, that they would be you would see a higher percentage of people in that audience actually change as a result. And as far as I'm concerned, and you both know this because we all work together, as far as I'm concerned, if people do not change their behavior or take a new action or rethink something as a result of your communication, it doesn't matter how much they enjoyed you, you have failed as a communicator. The point is to create change. If not to create change, what are we doing? So that would be my counter to your kind of counter example there is, I'd be curious to find out how many of those people walked away, went, "God, that was nuts," and then actually did something different.
Yeah, I think there is this, it's very easy to make this mistake when it comes to speaking. And speakers make this mistake all the time. Your job is not to leave people interested. Your job is not to leave people impressed. Your job is to leave them itchy. They need to walk away with an itch that they then need to scratch. Because if you haven't done that, it's like, "Oh, that was amazing. It blew my mind. I would love to watch more talks like that." But that wasn't the point, was it? I wasn't trying to sell you on more talks. I was trying to sell you on changing your life in some way. If you're not motivated to do that, I haven't done my job. So is there a better way to do that than a story? I would argue that there isn't. Now, maybe you can, and there's lots of other rhetorical tools that you can use, but for most people, they are just more difficult. Like, try to challenge me or Brian or yourself, do a 20-minute talk without a single example or a story, and try to make it interesting and emotional, all these things. It's super difficult.
It's almost impossible. I'm working with one of our former clients right now on they've booked their first big massive paid professional talk at a huge conference as the keynote, and of all the things for their first real major keynote at a professional speaker's fee, they've been asked to do 75 minutes, and I said to them, I said, can that include Q&A? And the client came back, their client came back and said it can include no more than 10 minutes of Q&A. So it's 65 minutes, and that means you really do need the full amount. You need to be prepared because often people won't ask questions, right? It just not at a conference setting like that. People are too nervous. So we're preparing 75 minutes, and I'm like, guess what? we're going to tell a lot of freaking stories. Like, because you're there to make one point, basically. Like this is a person giving a very specific core message in the advocacy space. And they're really trying to, if they try to make 5 points, they're not going to make anything. And so it's like, well, you're going to make 1 point for 75 minutes. How are you going to do that? How many studies can you put up? How many stats can you put on the screen? You're going to tell stories. Your story, other people's stories, not as their stories, but right? You can't tell somebody else's story. You can tell your perspective on their story, right? Or a case study, or here's a thing somebody said to me once. You have to. You're going to have to. Not just to fill the time, but I mean, sometimes to fill the time. Because like there's a difference between speaking for fun and speaking professionally. You're given constraints. There's always constraints. As a professional speaker, 75 minutes is a constraint because it's hard. It's a lot of time.
Something else that it's a weird thing about the way the human mind works, but is that a lot of people have the instinct that if you don't personalize the things you're saying, you make it easier for people to make it their own, right? I'm going to talk about this problem that people have, and then you're going to get it and make it, okay, this is how this applies to me. But it's actually the opposite, right? If I tell you that I used to drive a crappy Fiat Uno for a couple of years when I got my driver's license, it's very easy for you to think what your crappy first car was. But if I just say, I used to drive a crappy car, your brain is not making a substitution as easily. You're not going, oh, what was my crappy first car? Well, no, I didn't tell you what mine was, so why do you need to figure out yours? That is kind of how it works, weirdly enough. So this is why the whole, once upon a time in a land far away never works, is like, I'm not going to substitute for what matters to me because you didn't make it specific, so I don't think I need to make it specific for me. And that's the problem of not using stories and not using examples. People are just going, theoretically, I see how that would work, but they're not making it their own.
So this is a great way into myth number 2, which is you have to tell stories to be personable. Do you subscribe to that, Francisco?
Not to be personable, no. I think you can convey a lot of personality and warmth through humor, through eye contact, through smiles, through just the way you interact with the audience, even if there isn't a lot of back and forth, just your way. Usually you feeling comfortable in your own skin and being up there happy and enjoying it and kind of pointing to people. Like you get a lot of personality across, I think. But I think they might think you're a person they might enjoy having a drink with or whatever, but it won't connect beyond that level, right?
They won't feel like they know you a little bit.
There's always that vulnerability thing, right? If I'm up there and I'm being very impressive and funny and all these things, you might think, yes, I think I like this guy, I would like to spend some time with him, whatever. But if I don't share any type of struggle, professional or personal, you're not going to feel that warmth of like, oh no, I feel like I know you now, right? And which is why, whenever I'm going to talk about any struggles, I talk about actual struggles, right? I struggle, stuff with my children always has a lot of mileage and also lots of examples to pick from. So I think that is important as well.
I find one of the comments that I've made on so many requests to, hey, can you look at my first draft, that I get, hey, can I just pick your brain for a second? It's like, well, we have a whole program that you can pay for. No? Okay. So, fine. Let me let you pick my brain.
Lots
but
of
if
money,
right?
Can't be doing it for free. Sure, let's go for
listen,
free.
If it's a friend or somebody, whatever, I'll go, yeah, just send it over. Let me take a look. And I'll take it. One of the most common critiques I give first drafts is, it's really interesting, but you're not in it. Where are you? And like anybody who is in your field could give this talk, but you're going to be the one on stage. Because if anybody in your field could give this talk, hand it to an AI avatar, to an earlier conversation that we've had, or right, anybody could post this. If you don't tell me any stories at all, even a little one, sometimes the weirdest random detail, like a Fiat, right? Like just that could be, if that were the only thing I found out, I know a little, I kind of know a little bit about you. Like I just feel like you're a real human.
I had no money. Yes.
Right. Exactly. You had no money. Right. Exactly. Right. You find out, even sometimes it's in the example that someone chooses. Like we were working with a client recently who's a real proper scientist, and it was a pretty technical talk about some very innovative stuff that they were working on. And there was a moment when we had to pick an example of a type of drink that was a similar size to something that they were talking about. And we ended up choosing, it was like venti pumpkin spice latte with foam on top, whatever. The specific example chosen was just so much more interesting than saying about the size of a coffee cup. Right? Because it just told me a little bit more about you. And this was a drink this person never would have had. And that was actually why we learned about them, because you could just tell by looking at every order of that drink.
As you said that, I could taste it.
Right. Right.
My mouth is watering now, thank you.
Right. And maybe in a future episode, we can talk a little bit, Francisco, about where the line is with those kind of details, where we can go overboard or not. But why don't you kind of cap us off for this kind of, why aren't we hearing stories in business and in professional context when everybody in those contexts will tell you how important stories are?
And can I add a footnote to that?
Yeah.
When we do, why do people feel the need to announce them? Let me tell you a story. Oh. Francisco, you're on.
The folks just listening and not watching this should have seen Francisco's face. His whole body crumbled.
The eye roll.
I heard this from Sean Callahan, who's on my podcast. He runs a storytelling consultancy firm, and he says it's one of sort of his main rules is don't say the S word. And it is true, like there's no call for saying story because people have an association with a story that is not the type of story we actually want to use, which is actually why he named his company Anecdote. And I'm like, an anecdote is not a story. I was like, yeah, that's the point. I don't want people thinking of story because story just sends them the wrong way. I think there's just first of all, there's a misunderstanding about what at its most basic level a story is. Because if you understand it as an example that you're using to make a point, most people would understand that you would enhance almost any presentation by having examples of here's the problem, here's when we found this problem, here's how we tried figuring out the answer, this didn't work, this is what happened when we tried this other thing. So, it's like the story of the research you mentioned earlier. You just telling people things that actually happened to then make a larger point about it. So it was like, one event is not proof. No, it's not the data, right? It's just one point to illustrate the data, to make the data more intelligible, right? So if people just understood it as an example, a real life example, you would only not use it if you didn't have them, right? Because if you're a consultant and you're trying to talk to a client about the work you've done before, you would include examples. You wouldn't say, or case studies, like people want to call them, but that's the boring version of a story. You wouldn't go, we have worked with lots of companies in very successful projects. Which companies? What were the projects?
Take my word for it.
I was Nike and Novartis in big projects. What are the projects about?
Right.
Eventually, you're going to have to go, yes, this was their problem. As long as confidentiality allows, you say they had this type of problem. They called us in because they had tried this, and this thing. And then you have to go into the example at some point, even if it's in a more boring version, right? The main difference between a story is you just putting it in the most human of context, which is like, I got a call. And I answered the phone, and it was my contact at this company. And he said, Francisco, we are struggling with this thing. Right? It's just a more natural way of explaining what happened without corporate jargon and without all the nonsense people think they need to include to make themselves sound intelligent or important. Once they understand what a story is, half of the problem is gone because they realize that they should be using it. The other half is getting to the habit of collecting these things as they come up, right? Because if I just tell you, give me 5 examples of client work you've done that proves X, you might go, let me try and remember now, because you're not in the habit of remembering things that way. Those are two of the main reasons. They don't know what a story actually is or what it's for, and when they know, they don't really know how to find them, right? It's like, okay, I get you, but I'm not sure. Let me ask ChatGPT. That's not going to help.
Great topic for a future episode, how to find and collect those stories.